Today on Better Book Clubs, Bram Stoker's classic novel, Dracula. Bram Stoker's novel Dracula was published in 1897, and it wasn't really considered to be a great work of literature at the time. It was more a potboiler, a supernatural popular novel. In fact, Stoker wasn't really so much a writer as he was involved in the theater industry, so writing wasn't even really his first profession. He was drawing upon vampire mythology that already existed, but one of the reasons, maybe the primary reason that Dracula is considered a classic today is that Stoker really set that mythology in place. He really solidified it, and everything we think about vampires today, or at least most of it, comes from Stoker's imaginative account of Count Dracula. Also, the 1931 film in which Bela Lugosi played Dracula helped to solidify that mythology as well, but the film was based on Stoker's novel. So today I want to give you 5 tips for reading Dracula. It's not that it's a difficult read in the sense of some literary novels that maybe have ideas that are hard to grasp or language that's difficult to follow, but I did find some challenges in reading Dracula. So I want to suggest some ways for you to get over those challenges if you face them yourself. The first difficulty actually has to do with 2 preconceptions that we come to the novel with. One of them is our preconceptions about vampires. So you might think that you know a lot about the vampire mythology, but it might not match up with the story as Stoker is telling it. So some of the mythology might be ancient. Maybe you've read a lot about vampires and you know a lot about the ancient vampire mythology, or some of it might be coming from later popular culture. And in either case, you might find those preconceptions about vampires get in your way. So keep your mind open to recognizing the mythology as Stoker is setting it up. And in fact, there are a couple places in the novel where his characters lay those kind of rules out for us. One example that caused a problem for me was the fact that the vampires can come out of their bodies and sort of evaporate into a fog that lets them escape their coffins and their tombs and locked doors and kind of seep through the cracks. I had no idea that that was part of the mythology, and so I was struggling at one point trying to figure out how did that happen, that this vampire is not in her coffin when she's supposed to be. Maybe that's something in particular that you wouldn't struggle with, but there are parts of the mythology that you can't assume you know. So stick with what the novel is telling you and you'll have an easier time of it. The other preconception that might get in your way is a preconception about what makes a great novel. So this is a problem with a lot of classics. When we read them decades or even centuries later, it's really hard to see why they're such a big deal. The reason they're such a big deal is because they were the first to do something. So Stoker is doing something quite imaginative here, but it's hard for us to access because of everything that followed. You have to try and kind of put yourself back in that place where you don't know anything about vampires. They're not part of popular culture. They're not something that's been riffed on 100 or 1,000 times before. Now that's something that's pretty difficult to do as a reader, to step outside of all these preconceptions that we have, but at least recognizing that you might have preconceptions that are getting in the way can be really helpful. The second challenge that I had as a reader, that you might have as well, was that the first 60 pages of the novel were thrilling. I thought they were really exciting, even cinematic, and that there was a lot of suspense, and I felt like the main character, Jonathan Harker, was in danger at times, and I really was driven through those first 60 pages. But after that point, when we stop reading what's purported to be Harker's journal of his initial visit to Count Dracula's castle, and we get to the next section, as it were, of the novel, we start to be reading the journals and diaries and letters of a number of other characters. So we're no longer just in that one character's point of view, and that causes a couple of problems. One of them is that there are just a lot of people suddenly to keep track of that we didn't have to keep track of before. But the other is that the sense of immediacy gets lost. We don't have a narrator telling us the story as if it's happening right now in front of us. And even though the first section of the novel is also like that, it's a diary, because there's a single narrator, we get more of the sense, that novelistic sense that things are happening now. So I found it a little bit difficult to keep jumping from point of view to point of view and letter to diary to letter. And what was really difficult was that the characters didn't, some of them, get very well developed as a result. So what you might find useful is to pay attention to the little details that Stoker does give you about the differences in these characters. Maybe even keep notes of the characteristics of these characters so that you can develop them in your own mind, even if Stoker doesn't develop them so much for you on the page. One character in particular is difficult to read. His name is Dr. Van Helsing, and he's a Dutch doctor. He's the mentor to a man named Dr. Seward, who's also one of our narrators. And Seward calls Van Helsing in to help because Seward says that Van Helsing knows as much about obscure diseases as anyone in the world. And they're trying to figure out what's happened to this young woman who something strange and terrible is happening to her, and they haven't quite figured it out yet. So they call Van Helsing in. Well, because Van Helsing is Dutch and Stoker is playing around with dialect, he gives Van Helsing not quite perfect English. So it's very choppy to read, and he sometimes makes grammatical mistakes. And while that might help to flesh out his character a little bit for us, it really does get in the way at times. It can get to be annoying after a while. If you're finding his passages hard to read, I would suggest reading them out loud. You might find that it moves along, it flows along better when you're reading out loud than when you're trying to sort it out on the page. Aside from the fact that the characterization can be lacking at times in these different people's voices, that distance that it puts us at from the initial action can also be a little bit problematic. And so a lot of the time the characters are kind of strategizing with each other, trying to figure out what just happened and what should happen next. There are long stretches in the novel where there's not a lot of action, and then suddenly something big will happen and you will get some action-packed pages. But it's helpful, I think, to think of this as more of a parlor game novel, where you have people sitting around the table, whether literally or figuratively, trying to solve a problem. And if you think of it as that kind of mystery, I think that that will help carry you over between the sections of action, of high action, that really help to convey you forward through the novel. The last challenge I want to mention has to do with all the different layers of interpretation that this novel has been subjected to. There are so many different lenses that you can use to read this novel: a Freudian lens, a feminist lens, a religious lens, a historical lens. Although we can apply multiple lenses to any great novel, this novel, I think in particular, has been more publicly subjected to them. I think you're going to see glimmers of all of those different lenses as you're reading. And so you might find your reading feels more cohesive if you choose your own particular focus to put on the novel, whatever interests you the most or whatever starts to strike you the most as you're reading, and worry less about all of those other ways in which the novel can be read. Don't be too distracted by those and really pay attention to your own reading and what you're interested in. However you choose to read Dracula, it's a great novel because it is definitely part of the Western canon, no matter how you slice it. The fact that this character of Count Dracula has lasted for 125 years and only grown in popularity from the time of the novel's writing is really striking. In fact, you might even say that the immortality of that character is kind of like a vampire. I hope you enjoy reading Dracula for yourself. If you like what you see here, please subscribe, and I'll be back soon with another episode of Better Book Clubs.